This video is going to show you how to use watercolour. The first part of the video is going to look at some basic techniques for using watercolour. Firstly, make sure you have a good brush with a nice point on the end of it. Hold your brush close to the end of the brush so that you have maximum control. If you add lots of water to your colour, it will make it paler. The more paint you add, the stronger the colour. Adding paint onto wet surfaces will make the paint bleed. Look at the difference in tone created by different amounts of water. Using different paint will make different lines. A watery line might be too runny. A paint line that's too dry might be rough. You want to get the right consistency of your paint so that you can paint a controlled, smooth line like this. Next, we're going to look at blending colours. We're going to start off with a square of red, and next to it we're going to put in a square of yellow. We're going to blend the two of these so that we don't have that harsh line in the middle, so that the colours blend gradually. Use a damp brush, not wet, dry it off on a paper towel, but wet enough to make the colours bleed. Here we're doing it again with blue and yellow. Wet your brush, clean it, and dry it off on some paper towel, and then go over the join of the two colours to blend the colours, like this. Next, we're going to look at creating darker tones of a colour. So, start off with your red, and then think about how you could create a darker tone. Now, don't reach for the black. Try and use the opposite colour to dull down the colour. It gives a bit more depth, and then we can paint right next to it and using the same technique blend over the join between the two tones. Now you can see it gradually changing from dark to light. We'll try that again with a different colour. We'll start off with orange, and then we'll try and make a darker orange by adding the opposite colour, blue, to our palette to create that darker tone. With a damp brush, go over the join to create the blend. Pause the video here and have a go yourself. So now we're going to look at how you can use this thick opaque watercolour in your development study. Start off by choosing one object to focus on and mix up the colour that you need. It's better to mix your own colour than using the colours straight from the palette. Gradually build up the tones that you can see. Remember to use the opposite colour to create darker tones and start to look for the light and the dark areas. Use a damp brush to blend the tones together. Remember that there might be other colours that reflect in your object from the objects round about. Don't be afraid to see if you see reflections of other colours like yellows, browns, blues, to add those in as you see them. Here I'm adding in some yellow. I'm building up the shadows to make sure there's a strong contrast between the light and the dark areas. Now move on to your next object. Remember, the opposite colour will help to darken your tones. Look for the contrast between the light shapes and the dark shapes. And don't be afraid to include other colours if you see them reflected in the objects. This will help make your object look more realistic. For highlights, you might struggle if you don't have much white in your palette. I've used a tiny drop here of white squeezy paint to start to add in the highlights. If you're not happy with the white, leave this bit and we can sort it later. Adding in the highlights really starts to make your object look 3D. It's the highlights and the shadow which give the object a form. Keep looking at your photograph. Don't assume that you know what everything looks like. Your eyes should be constantly darting between the photograph and your page. Remember, the more tones and the more colours that you can add in, the more realistic your object will look. Again, the highlights and the dark areas are going to be what makes your object become more realistic and three-dimensional. Don't be afraid to build up the colours and tones gradually. Half close your eyes to see the dark areas and the light areas. Remember, in spaces where the light finds it difficult to get into, the objects will be darker. Where the object is facing the light and the light is falling down onto it as a highlight, these will be more obvious. Now have a go with your photograph. Remember to use thick opaque paint, blend your tones and look for the highlights and the shadows. Do your best.